All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the Everything College Football podcast. Today, me and Nick here will be discussing the news of Alex Grinch finally getting fired as defensive coordinator at USC. We'll be talking about his tenure along with some potential candidates. Timestamp will be below if you want to skip to that. But focusing on this, abysmal tenure, Nick, it started last year. Lincoln Riley abruptly left Oklahoma for USC. Massive hire from Mike Bond and co. Able to, really get a good hire, falling, drastic downward spiral under Clay Helton. And, last year USC's defense, it wasn't great really at all. I mean, it started off pretty good. They had 3 games in a row where they allowed less than 330 yards leading into the Utah game in Salt Lake City. They were up double figures in that one. Ended up giving up 562 yards in a comeback by the Utes. They ended up losing that one by, a single point. You remember Brandon Kuthi, or no, I think it was Dalton Kincaid, had 15 receptions or something like that, 230 yards, from a tight end they allowed. I mean, it was just a disaster in that game. And then the next 2 weeks, they, won one-score games, 2 straight weeks against in-conference opponents in Arizona and Cal. But they still gave up a lot of yards in those games, almost, 900 yards total in those contests, or almost 1,000 that is, combined. The year went on. They ended up forcing 4 turnovers on the road at UCLA. Still gave 45 points. Notre Dame, they really cracked down well. This is a team that was in playoff consideration, right? And then they went to the Utah rematch. Caleb Williams and this offense were hot. Pulls his hamstring. Offense sputters, and the defense was not able to do their part. 533 yards allowed in that one. And in the bowl game, 300-plus rushing, 200-plus passing. Second game in a row, they allowed numbers like that, Nick. And that's just where, the USC season ended. 2 straight losses to end the year with this defense really being the major headlines. They just completely fumbled as the year went on. And Lincoln Royals, his loyalty is the biggest reason why Grinch stuck around. Understand not getting rid of the guy after one season because, again, it's your first year together at this new program. And, that's certainly something that it's probably the only reason why he stuck there. No need for a major shakeup, right? But these guys had worked together since 2019, a couple of years at Oklahoma together. So this was a standard, really, of Alex Grinch. He's not very good coach on the defensive side of the ball. And his bled into 2023, which has really ruined Caleb Williams' tenure at USC. And really this entire program, this was a tough year for them altogether, mainly because of this one guy on the defensive side of the ball.
These numbers are just gaudy and just terrible. And these numbers are similar to Iowa's offensive numbers, just 2 terrible units. I mean, total D 122nd in the nation, run defense 120th. I applaud Rick and Riley for being loyal to a fault, right? But it seems like that fault has been a very major fault here for USC. Alex Grinch, you and I both labored over it all offseason saying how he should not return as defensive coordinator. And this defense is getting continuously worse and worse. The numbers this year are just pathetic. And he finally gets his working papers and he's out of here. He's gone. He took over a defense at Oklahoma from Mike Stoops after they had a bad game against Texas and Stoops was fired. And when Lincoln Riley joined the staff at Oklahoma, started trying to run his ship. He brought on Grinch here, and Grinch, I think people kind of didn't realize or overlooked how poor Oklahoma's defense was under Grinch because it was the Big 12. And there is this, expectation that Big 12 defenses are not that good and they're going to put up a lot of points regardless. So then he goes out west to the Pac-12 where the defense is better and there are teams like Utah, like UCLA, other teams that have really solid defenses that can really hit you often. And now USC just was not able to contend with this terrible defense. I mean, the 12.5 missed tackles per game. They were bailed out last year by a lot of interceptions. That was a big thing they had, was a ton of interceptions and some tackles for loss. This year, without the tackles for loss or the interceptions, it's certainly continuing to show that this team is in a downward spiral. Grinch had to go. I didn't think it was going to happen. I thought it was going to be maybe at the end of the season, but to fire him right now in the middle of the season definitely shocked me when I saw that news today. This is an interesting move. Certainly, obviously, it had to happen, but we have to see where they go from here. Who is Lincoln Riley going to bring in? Who's going to be calling the plays on the side of the ball? And are they going to be able to fix this mess next year and get this team potentially back to competing for national championship? That was the expectation with Williams this year. They're clearly not going to be competing for national championship this year. They will not be competing for a Pac-12 title. A disastrous tenure for Alex Grinch out west.
Yeah, in 2022, they were able to snag 19 interceptions. That was really their saving grace, being able to create. They had 3 All-Americans on that side of the ball, and Kalen Bullock, Mekhi Blackman, and Tui Pelotu. But you would have never guessed it with how bad they played, especially down the stretch. Again, that Notre Dame game, I think they played very well. That's probably the best game of the year on defense. But just it was a colossal failure what they were able to do against Tulane, where they also blew a double-figure lead. All 3 losses last year, double-figure leads blown, Nick. That's something that got to be partially blamed on the offense as well, but your defense, it has to be held to a higher standard. You can't be, expected to score on every single possession. That's just not how you're going to play winning football. And then this year, their staple, the interception certainly dried up, but they're able to, create sacks, get tackles for loss, but those started to dry up, less than 6 in each of the last 4 games for this defense in terms of tackles for loss, not able to get into the backfield as much. And that's pretty much all she wrote. And I think the biggest thing with this defense is 44 points per game allowed over the last 6 games. The run defense has just been an embarrassment, really. Not just the missed tackles, just poor assignments. Even when they do get some penetration, the guy's still able to, the running back is still able to showcase patience and pick up 4 or 5 yards. And this is the case each week. 3 weeks in a row, they give up 230 plus rushing, 11 touchdowns total on the ground the last 3 weeks. Against pretty poor offenses. Cal, Jaden Nutt's a really impressive back with 235 and 5 scores. Shouldn't happen. Dylan Johnson put up 4 touchdowns, 236 yards rushing. A team that doesn't run the ball at all was able to put up 300 plus on them. Just a flat out embarrassment, Nick. And I said last year, USC, they were just trying to learn how to play football again, because under Clay Helton, you saw some of the same things, missed tackles, poor angles, just the football IQ wasn't always that great, especially with penalties. And the penalties haven't been as bad, but I think it's gotten all worse in terms of technicalities and fundamentals. You see it with the cornerbacks. They seem to get beat every single time in one-on-one coverage. The middle of the field's always open with post routes. Underneath, they're not all that great either. Just it seems anything that could go wrong for them goes wrong. Guys like Corey Foreman and Damani Jackson, 5-star recruits, have just been nothing really. Foreman's redshirted this year. Jackson's just been terrible at corner. The thing about this USC defense is the bad is very bad with them, Nick, and I think it's just as a fan of the program and fans across Southern California just shake their head every time they take the field, because it was that bad, especially over this last month.
Tuipulotu was such a talented player for them, and losing him to the draft is also having a big impact, clearly. He's having a great season with the Chargers so far in his rookie year, so losing him and the other All-Americans is having a clear impact. They don't really seem to have a highlight standout guy here. No one's really making that big jump forward. Like you said, 5-star recruits are not living up to expectations. I'm going to be honest. I thought Bear Alexander would have a bigger impact, and I think he's not having as big an impact as he could have. He comes over from Georgia. He should be having an incredible impact. I just think he's been quiet. You really haven't seen him, in my opinion. The defense is bad. They're giving up so many points per game. It's just an atrocious numbers from this team. And it's really disappointing. It continues to be disappointing if you're a USC fan. It's just an absolute problem. 34.5 points per game, 345 points given up throughout the season are just terrible numbers for this team. The yards per game is too much, 436. All over the board, this defense is so bad. They're going to have to find someone who can come in and really work on the fundamentals. We said it last year. You just were talking about how you had to get back to playing football in the post-Clay Helton era. They got to figure out how to tackle. They got to wrap up tackles, the missed tackles. They're just not finishing tackles. They got to go back to real fundamental football on defense if they want to even be remotely considered contenders for a national championship in the next couple of years with Lincoln Riley. They got to figure this out big time, because this is a problem for the USC Trojans.
132nd nationally in plays. They just can never get off the field. And just bad alignments from the play caller. You see, wide alignments from the linebackers, and second and third and short. You see, third and short against the pass. They'll be playing DBs 10 plus yards off the ball. The players have not been put in the best position at all. And I think this is certainly a talented unit. There's some good players on here. Mason Cobb, Kalen Bullock, obviously we talked about him being an All-American last year. Tackett Curtis, a freshman, certainly has struggled. Jamil Muhammad, Solomon Byrd, some of these guys have really stepped up this year and helped this team out. But some of these other guys just have not progressed. Bear Alexander, like you said, he's been good this year, but inconsistent in terms of his, impact. And Braylon Shelby, a nice freshman as well. A lot of people are worried about why he continues to be in coverage and he gets burned every single time. Just bad coaching. They did pick up some nice transfers. Mason Cobb was one of them. Muhammad, the aforementioned him. Anthony Lucas as well. Shane Lee is also a transfer. Some of these guys that just seem to be the same football players 2 years in a row, including Bryson Shaw, who's just awful. So a lot of work that needs to be done, Nick, like you said. That leads us to some potential candidates to fill this role. And this is a guy I talked about, last January, February, Jim Leonhard. He parted ways with Wisconsin. Luke Fickell showed up, ends up going to Illinois in a bit of an analyst role. Obviously, this is he comes from a defense, a 3-4. They love the create. They get their outside backers coached up to be physical, high IQ football players. The defensive line, year after year, they're great against the run. And, it just starts with, good coaching and physicality and discipline. And that's where, the Badgers had their staple. And then Leonhard himself, just being a former defensive back coach. This is a guy that certainly is destined for a lot of things this year. I believe he did interview with the Green Bay Packers for their DC role sometime last year. I think he's kind of taking a year off. That's why he's at Illinois with Brett Bielema, Aaron Henry. They're just kind of chilling this year, seeing what's available. And I think that this would have been a job for him. Maybe this is something he's looking for. Grinch, of course, didn't get the axe last year, but now that it has happened, is this something that Leonhard might contend, especially with his familiarity with the Big Ten? It's certainly a call that Riley would make, but would Leonhard entertain it?
I think this is certainly something that he has to entertain if you're Jim Leonhard here. He might just be taking the year off, like you said, just taking it easy and having that sort of analyst role. I was surprised he didn't get a job as a defensive coordinator anywhere. I was surprised Fickell didn't retain him. I really thought he was going to get retained. He looked great under Paul Chryst. That team was very solid defensively, and he was a pretty good interim head coach, 4-3. Steadied the ship for Wisconsin last year. So I think he should have definitely got a look. I think he has to get a look from USC this time. I saw a lot of message boards, a lot of USC fans, some YouTube channels dedicated to the Trojans, some fan-run YouTube channels saying they have to hire Leonhard even before they fired Grinch. Leonhard's a popular name. I think pretty much everyone in Southern Cal wants him to be the one that gets the call here. I think it would be a home run hire. Obviously, he's a fantastic coach. We knew that at Wisconsin. Those teams were very solid, very good defensive units. The defense wasn't the problem in Wisconsin. The offense was the problem. And I think when he didn't get retained last year, I thought that was a bit of a shocking move here. Now he's in Illinois as an analyst. I think he's just keeping his feet warm and getting ready to make that big jump forward. Landing a guy like Leonhard would be a huge grab for USC.
Yeah, a guy that thrived at utilizing 3-star or worse talent, under-recruited guys at Wisconsin. They end up being really good football players. The 3-4 has been great in the Big Ten. Violent, tough defenders. They fight up front, unlock the opportunity for those linebackers to thrive. Those are the playmakers for them. Very disciplined on the edge. That's something USC has a big problem with, is just being disciplined up front as a whole. Just, a lot of aggression, mixed with being an excellent DB coach. And then I think USC, they'll do a little bit better on the recruiting trail as well. They're certainly have more talented players. That's got to be the way to go for USC. He'd probably be the favorite, especially for most fans. And I know a lot of people are making articles last year about him being the guy, and no one else has really gotten much focus. Justin Wilcox, Cal Berkeley head coach, a guy that certainly has just kind of ran his course at Cali, and we figured he'd be on the hot seat coming into this season. We'd like to see what he could do after numerous years. His offense has finally improved, but at the same time, his defense is at the worst it's ever been for the Golden Bears. He's been there since 2017, Nick, where for the first couple of seasons, everyone knew how good this guy's defenses were, and that was the staple with Cal. Their offense, though, on the other hand, was completely poor, one of the worst in the conference. And now it's kind of, again, it's just ran its course where it's really shifted tides to your offense is starting to get to a better point, but the defense, the lack of recruiting and, the other schools, their advancement on offense is really starting to catch up to them. And I think this is just kind of a role where he's overwhelmed at this moment in time. 4-8 last year, 3-5 at this moment in time. The offense, they're trying to keep up as much as they can with teams like, Oregon State and Washington, USC, they lost that game by a point, and they're just unable to do so, right? So I certainly think this is just kind of a full storm for Justin Wilcox. He's still a great defensive coach, and I don't think that's lost by any means, even though they're giving up, 36 or 37 points per game this year. Again, it's just kind of really ran its course here. A tough place to try and build a program there in Northern California. This is certainly a guy that runs, a variety of different schemes. 3-3-5, 3-4, 2-4-5 as well with 2 down linemen. He preaches, his defense being able to drop into coverage, protect those throwing lanes, but also having some versatile players, with nice skill sets to protect every area of the football field. Very well coached defense, even when they are getting beat and giving up yards and points, Nick. That's certainly not lost one bit. I think Justin Wilcox, a guy who was here in the past, also made his staple felt at Wisconsin and Washington in the past. This would be a perfect hire, I would say, for one of these guys. He's very familiar with this area of the country. He's from Eugene, did play at Oregon, so plenty of ties here to some of the future conference foes that'll be joining them in the Big Ten, mainly this region, though. I think Justin Wilcox, even though his record at Cal is not great, this would be a nice little hire to kind of get him back into tune with his passion of coaching defense.
If Justin Wilcox is let go by Cal, which we assume is most likely going to happen, Cal has slid pretty severely the last couple of weeks. They've lost 4 in a row, and they look like they may not even get another win the rest of the season. They got an opportunity at Stanford, but they got to play at UCLA, hosting Washington State. They may win one of those 2 games. I think Wilcox is certainly going to be on the outs here. I like Justin Wilcox as defensive coach a whole lot. That Wisconsin team he had in 2016 was a very solid defense. They were pretty good under Paul Chryst. They went 11-3, won the Cotton Bowl, top 10 in pretty much every category. Then he went to he was at USC prior to that. I think that was a very decent defense as well. That had some improvements. They finished top 50 nationally in scoring defense, and they were 65th in total defense. Not a bad number for USC under Clay Helton. Under Steve Sarkisian. This is I think he's a solid coach. I think this is a guy that has some seriously nice potential at Cal. It just hasn't really worked out. The defense has regressed massively. They're one of the only defenses that is worse or nearly worse than USC. USC's giving up 436 yards per game. Cal's giving up 427 this year, and Cal is giving up more points per game as well at 36.8. So I think that's certainly something concerning. But if he is focusing fully on being a defensive coordinator, I think he has a fantastic opportunity to get the job done here in Southern California. I think he's a fantastic recruiter who's got a good talent net. He's worked with bad talent in Cal. Obviously, the academic standards are tough to work with up there at Berkeley. He's a very talented defensive coordinator who has a good building block here, in my opinion. If he was to come down to USC, I think this would be a great hire if he is let go by Cal. Very good experience, and it's fantastic to land a former head coach to call your plays if he can do so.
Now, looking at another guy from the Big Ten, Joe Rossi, started at Rutgers. That was the start of the conference. That is back in 2012. Left them in 2015. Ended up at Minnesota in 2017. He's been there ever since. Full-time defensive coordinator since 2019. I remember in 2020, after that season, I was like, Minnesota, they're going to be awful on defense moving forward because they lost a lot of players that weren't very good in 20. And then the last 3 years, they've just been phenomenal on this side of the ball. And, it's kind of interesting how they do it. They preach, physicality as well, trying to create some havoc. This is a team in Minnesota in 2022. They're one of the top scoring defenses, right? But they're dead last in tackles for loss. They don't create a whole lot of negative plays, and they're still able to hold their opponents, 13.8 points per game, limit them to, not a lot of yardage. I mean, that's just impressive from Joe Rossi and his unit. Of course, you do play some pretty scarce offenses in that conference, but, there's some numbers I remember reading off. I don't remember off the top of my head, but when we did our Minnesota preview, they were pretty impressive over the last couple of years when it comes to allowing yardage. It's not something they do a whole lot. Rossi under PJ Fleck, they certainly have regressed on offense themselves, and the defense has really had to play hard. And it certainly has. They've, last couple of games, 12 points for Michigan State. Holding Iowa to 10 is not anything impressive, but 127 yards, that's still pretty notable. Obviously they kind of get bushwhacked against Michigan, some of these tougher opponents with the inabilities on offense, of course. Joe Rossi, I think, a guy also working with a lot of below-average talent. A team that's got a lot of young guys out there. But they've really developed players in the secondary. Tyler Nubbin's going to be one of the top safeties taken in the NFL draft. And, they've had a handful of guys transfer out in years past. But they've also been really good players. Justin Whaley, for example, he's still there. Terrell Smith, a lot of people like him as an NFL draft prospect. He's currently in the NFL. Jordan Hoden, 2022. Some of those guys in the secondary are very good players for Minnesota. This is a guy I think can certainly develop those guys in the back end. I'd like to see more production from his front seven, but again, it just kind of comes from just playing toughness at the line of scrimmage, and that's what they do.
I think this is certainly a tough coach for this Minnesota team. The Minnesota team's a hard-hitting, solid defense. This team has looked good. Previously was a Rutgers defensive coordinator. Then he got to Minnesota. He was the interim DC in 2018. He earned that job. He fought for it, got it. In 2019, that defense looked better. 2020, that defense was not bad. So I think this is a guy who can certainly coach. He's a young guy, 44 years old. This USC team is making the transition to the Big Ten pretty soon, so it's good to have a coach who has experience in the Big Ten, in my opinion. I think you got to look at that if you're considering this. If you're working in that front office over there at USC, you would want to consider somebody who has experience coaching in the conference you're joining. Big Ten physical, defensive-focused football, in my opinion, compared to the Pac-12, where we see a little bit less emphasis on some of those hard-hitting, grind and pound sort of players that they do emphasis at Minnesota. I think Rossi would be a good hire. I think Rossi has some good opportunities to get the job done in USC. I think he brings a more physical brand of defense, which certainly is something the Trojans could use.
Yeah, then looking to Iowa State, down in Ames, John Heacock. This is a guy that certainly has been flashing under the radar for a lot of years. Again, like you said, the typical notion of this conference is they don't play very good defense. And, Matt Campbell and his bunch, they've certainly changed that narrative. He's been at Iowa State since 2016, so trying to pluck him away is certainly going to be tough. But, he's making, $850,000 a year. So they can give him a pretty nice raise if he comes out to LA. This is a defense we talked about with the, on our preseason preview of the Cyclones, on how they just continue to play elite defense. Last year they didn't give up a single game of 400 yards. And, they play every single opponent tough. This is last year of, 11-14, 9-10, 21-24 to teams like Texas and Kansas State and Kansas. Those were three of the best teams in the conference last year, at least on the offensive side of the ball. They're just completely holding them up, you know what I mean? So this year it's been a little bit tougher. They gave up 2 games of 400-plus yards. They only lost one of those. They play a very physical, tough brand of ball, Nick, especially against the run. They're also really good against the pass as well. Heacock loves to play with 5 in the box, allows for some more speed in the back end, but there's also plenty of free space in that secondary. If his 4-2-5 He certainly has perfected the scheme, it seems, especially in this conference where there's a lot of high-flying offenses. And they've given Lincoln Riley and his offense plenty of fits over the years. Back in 2021, they only gave up 300 yards and a 7-point loss. Before that, they gave away 414 in an upset victory at home over Oklahoma. Remember the all-time series, Iowa State-Oklahoma, it's completely lopsided in favor of the Sooners, like 90 wins to less than 10 for Iowa State before Matt Campbell got there. Year in, year out, he was completely testing these Sooners. The year before that, in 2019, they did give up 500 yards, but they lost by only a point. I mean, this is a guy, Nick, that has, seriously progressed this defense over the past couple of years with, average Joes on that side of the ball. We talked about it. We said we really don't know where they find these guys and who's going to be the good ones outside of, 2 or 3 names. And look at him again, one of the better defenses in the nation and in the conference.
This is a guy who's been around college football for a while. I think this would be a pretty interesting hire. He's got the experience in the sport. He was a head coach at Youngstown State in the FCS. He succeeded Jim Trussell, actually, after Trussell left for Ohio State. He was pretty solid at Youngstown State, went to the playoffs twice, won the conference. They went to the FCS semifinals once. That was 2006. Then he resigned from Youngstown State, spent some time at Kent State, Purdue, and then Toledo, where he was the associate head coach under Matt Campbell at Toledo, then followed Campbell to Ames, Iowa, where Campbell and Iowa State, we continue to say at Iowa State, we rave about them because it's really, truly impressive what Matt Campbell is able to do with the lack of talent. I mean, they're just pulling guys off of small town high schools in Iowa and throwing them in who are just going to make their careers and find the job done. I mean, he had Brock Purdy at quarterback, who ended up now going to the NFL and having a pretty good run after being drafted last overall. And, he's working hard there, Campbell, and this is a great guy, Heacock, who's been a fantastic defensive coach for this Iowa State team. This Iowa State team is very defensively strong. They hold their opponents to a small number of points. They have good, physical, hard-hitting defense. This is a guy that's a veteran who's not going to take, any crap from these young players. He's going to be able to coach them and get, sort of physical brand of football focused, back to fundamentals. Grab your target, tackle, and put him on the ground sort of thing. Very efficient tackling football. I think this would be an interesting hire because this is a guy who can contrast some of maybe Lincoln Riley's inexperience. I know Lincoln Riley gets more experience as the years go on, but he still is a relatively inexperienced head coach. This is a guy that's been in football, for 30 years now, who has some good experience coaching at the FCS level, being an associate head coach at the Group of 5 level. I think this would be a very interesting hire. A guy that's a veteran of the sport who has some good experience and can lend a pretty good coaching hand.
Yeah, I think as a veteran, he could certainly critique Riley's offense as well, considering he had plenty of success against them. I think that's something that could certainly be beneficial for both sides. Looking at the last candidate on this list, obviously guys like Dave Aranda, kind of fits in the Justin Wilcox category. He's probably not going to be on the hot seat till the end of next year, but maybe they could offer him a nice salary to come back to a more calm role as defensive coordinator. But one of my favorite coordinators since, I've ever been a college football fan, Tony Gibson. He was great at West Virginia. Those teams in Morgantown always played crushing defense, with Dana Holgerson. And then he transferred over to NC State in 2019. And, he's been good for them. This is a guy that preaches a tough physical brand of football. They're very aggressive. They're all, they're really good at jarring the football loose, creating turnovers. At NC State right now, they have one of the top defenses in the country, and that's been the case the last couple of seasons. They do a great job of developing their players, especially at linebacker. They've had some really impressive guys in the middle of their defense. They have been productive. I think they've also did that in really all facets of this defense. Obviously, NC State's really never gotten over the hump, and I don't think they will under Dave Doran. I think their ceiling has certainly been met, and it certainly has been a bumpy road at times for Tony Gibson, that is. But when he got there in 2019, it wasn't a good defense. 30 points allowed. The next year down to 29, and since then, they've been under 20 points per game, and they're trending slightly above that right now due to a bit of a poor offense. But this is a unit that goes out each and every week. Everyone in this conference knows they're going to be a tough ask, especially in home games. Nick, I think Tony Gibson would certainly be great. And, not only having a chaos defense, that's what people call Alex Grinch's defense, but also doing it the right way with discipline, focus, and physicality.
I think this is a pretty interesting name you want to throw out here. People forget that those early 2000 Rich Rodriguez teams were very good, hard-hitting secondary defensive back units, which is what Gibson coached until 2007 with Rodriguez. Then he followed Rich Rodriguez to Michigan, was the associate head coach there. Obviously, Rodriguez's time with Michigan did not really work out very well for them up in Ann Arbor. He got sent away after that. He went back to West Virginia under Dana Holgerson, and that was a pretty solid defense. That was a good, hard-hitting unit. And NC State's been a better defensive unit over the past couple of seasons. I do agree with you that Dorian's reached his ceiling. at NC State. I don't think there's any sort of progression coming out of that. So I think this would be a good move for Gibson. Head out west, head to a big, high-profile program, and get to coach a defense that does need a lot of work. I think he would be a good coach for this system. He's making $835,000 a year at NC State. I certainly think that USC can do better than that and offer him a nice pay package to head west. I think this would be an interesting hire. He's a good veteran experience. He was coaching at West Virginia 20 years ago as a defensive backs coach, and those were, like I said, very good teams. Defensively, I think people forget that because they had the flashy offenses that put up a lot of points and did some fun stuff on the field. This would be a very interesting hire for me. I think Gibson is a good coach, who's a veteran of the game at this point, and coaches some pretty good defense.
Yeah, that's going to be it for our candidates list. I just kind of want to get your thoughts on what do you think will happen here, Nick, because last time, they kind of went through this process of getting a coach. SC fans were expecting a splash, and I think what happened with Lincoln Riley was certainly exceeding expectations to a major team. I mean, that was just an ecstatic day in LA when that happened, and they're going to expect a splash here in this defensive coordinator position. They can go out and really get anyone in the country they want within reason, of course. I think that's going to be the expectation here. Promoting from within would absolutely just drain the hearts of all these fans. I don't think you're going to see anything like that. They got to go out and get somebody, especially one of these guys on our list. So ultimately, what do you think will happen? Do you have a prediction of who they will hire? If not, do you think it will be splashy, or do you think it'll just be a mid-average hire that's, not going to get as much excitement as you would previously have thought?
I'm going to go out there and say they're going to hire Wilcox. I think Wilcox will get fired by Cal, and he will head down to USC. I think they'll return him. I think that's a great hire. In my opinion, I do like that hire. When they hired Lincoln Riley, like you said, it was a shock. I really thought Lincoln Riley was heading straight to LSU. I figured that was going to be where he ended up down in Baton Rouge. They obviously settled on Brian Kelly instead, and that's worked out for them, and this has worked out for USC. And, each their own at this point, although both teams have pretty bad defenses this year, which is kind of funny in how it's worked out. I think Wilcox would be a great hire, though. I think he's a good coach who has experience in the Pac-12, experience recruiting in the area, experience working with talent that isn't the best at Cal. So if he can get better talent at USC, I think the sky's the limit, certainly. Leonhard would be a fantastic hire as well. I just don't know if Leonhard's going to make that jump. Leonhard might make a move somewhere else as well. There might be some SEC openings or some Big Ten openings that come up next year. I like Wilcox for this role here. I think Wilcox makes a whole lot of sense for USC. I think you can't hire within. I don't think that makes any sense at all. And I think they're going to go for probably someone, a big flashy. I think Wilcox is a flashy name. You're getting a guy who was a head coach in the same conference that you were just in, now coming down to coach your defense. I think that's a big grab to do that. I know they're not going to be in the same conference anymore, but I still think that means a little bit something to some fans. I think that'd be a fantastic move for USC.
Now, how likely of it, what's the likelihood you think of them going out and getting a wild card like Dave Aranda, who's still going to be with Baylor, or maybe a guy like Jeff Fisher, the 65-year-old former NFL tenured head coach who's still kind of involved in the football scene in some other leagues? What do you think that possibility is, which would completely blow the doors off of these fans, I would say, at least from an excitement perspective? I certainly think a veteran mind, especially like that, could potentially benefit them.
I actually think it's very possible for a school like USC. Obviously money is not an issue out there in LA, a very profitable school in the NIL era, a very big name school making a huge move to the Big Ten. They got to make a splash, probably, if you want to think about it realistically, moving to a new conference in the Big Ten where the competition is going to step up. I love the Pac-12, and I'm sad that's going away, but the competition will step up in the Big Ten. You're right. They could make a total splash move and just grab somebody crazy, maybe somebody who's really good in the SEC or Aranda, something like that. You really could make a crazy move. I'm going to throw this out there. This would just be kind of crazy, but Clark Leah at Vanderbilt, maybe they grab someone like him. Vanderbilt could be looking to make a change. They've really regressed under this year. So maybe a crazy name like that is certainly possible at this point. I think, anything could happen with USC concerning the money they have and the high profile, very national name playing in the nation's second largest city.
Yeah, maybe a guy like Brad White over at Kentucky. But yeah, like you said, that's certainly a possibility. Should be a very lengthy search. I know a lot of people will be eager to see what happens here, especially with the switch over to the conference. LSU and USC meet in Vegas next year, so it'll be a big opportunity to see what type of things have been progressed in the offseason. And, of course, all the transfers. And, of course, that's a long ways away. It's going to be it for today's episode, Nick. I appreciate you joining me. Interesting discussion today. Unfortunate this firing took this long, but better late than never.
Certainly fun when we get into this whole, coaching carousel sort of thing. We love doing this when we get to the off season. A little bit early here talking about this. I'm sure more coaches will be fired and we'll be able to discuss it on some episodes in the future. First one down. Interesting to see where USC goes from here.
Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.
New head coach, new defensive coordinator.